The sound of snapping wood shattered the quiet morning. It was a sickening crack, followed immediately by the soft, tragic thud of blooming antique roses hitting the wet mud. I just stood there. My hands were covered in dark, damp earth. My breathing was steady, even though a hurricane was raging inside my chest. Right in front of me, breathing heavily and red in the face, was a man wearing a custom Italian suit that probably cost more than my truck. He was pointing a trembling, manicured finger right at my face. "You did this. You ungrateful piece of trash," he screamed. His voice echoed off the ancient stone walls of the estate, carrying a level of venom that made my stomach turn. "You destroyed her property. Because you're a jealous, pathetic loser." I didn't flinch. I didn't yell back. I didn't defend myself with a single word. Instead, I took a deliberate half-step backward. I wrapped my mud-stained arms around my 6-year-old daughter, pulling her face into my chest, so she wouldn't have to look at the sheer ugliness of human greed. She was clutching her coloring book tightly, her little body trembling like a fragile leaf in a harsh wind. I just held her close, pressing my chin to the top of her head. I let him scream. I let him hurl every insult he could think of. Because as a father, I learned a long time ago that sometimes, the most deafening roar a man can make is absolute, unshakable silence. But as I stood there, taking the abuse, I knew something he didn't. I knew that the very mud he was currently standing on was about to completely ruin his life. To understand how we got to this ugly moment, you have to understand what this garden meant to me. I am just a gardener. I don't have a fancy title. And I don't have a corner office. Ever since my wife passed away 3 years ago, my entire world shrank down to 2 things: my little girl and the soil beneath my boots. When the young millionaire who owned this estate hired me, this garden was nothing but a forgotten, overgrown patch of dead weeds. She was a brilliant, sharp woman who traveled the world. But she wanted a sanctuary to come home to. I promised her I would build her one. And I did. For 18 months. I poured my soul into this earth. I carefully cultivated rare antique roses, coaxing them back to life with gentle hands and endless patience. I transformed the barren courtyard into a healing paradise. It became a sanctuary, not just for the estate owner, but for my daughter. Every morning, while I pruned and watered, my little girl would sit quietly under the shade of a massive, weathered oak tree. She would read her books, draw her pictures, and sing softly to the butterflies. This garden was our safe haven. It was the only place where the grief of losing her mother didn't feel so heavy. But peace is a fragile thing, especially when money is involved. The estate owner had gone on a 2-week business trip to Europe. In her absence, she allowed her distant cousin to stay in the guest house. He was a man who reeked of entitlement and cheap cologne. He was the kind of guy who looked at the world and only saw price tags. He had spent the last week strutting around the property like he owned it, barking orders at the staff, and treating everyone like dirt. But his arrogance wasn't his worst trait. It was his greed. Earlier this morning, I was meticulously watering the rose beds. I had soaked the earth deeply, turning the dry dirt into a soft, yielding mud, to help the roots drink in the summer heat. That was when he walked up to me. He was wearing a pair of brand new, glossy leather designer shoes, with distinct, pointed toes. He didn't even bother saying hello. He just looked at a row of incredibly rare, century-old bonsai trees, and some of the most expensive antique rose bushes I had cultivated. "Listen to me, dirt digger," he said, keeping his voice low. "I have a buyer lined up. A private collector in the city." I kept working, acting like I didn't hear him. "We load those bonsais and 5 of those antique rose bushes into a truck tonight," he continued, stepping closer. "I get paid. And I'll toss a few $100 your way. She'll never even know they're missing. We'll just say the frost got them." I finally stopped. I stood up straight, wiping my hands on my canvas apron, and looked him dead in the eye. "No," I said quietly. His smug smile vanished. "Excuse me," he snapped. I said no. "I don't steal from the person who feeds my family, and I don't destroy beautiful things for a quick buck. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I turned my back on him, and walked over to where my daughter was coloring under the oak tree. That simple rejection completely shattered his fragile ego. He couldn't handle the fact that a lowly, dirt-stained worker had just dismissed him. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched right into the center of the prized antique rose garden. With a primal grunt of rage, he grabbed the main wooden support of the grand trellis, and violently yanked it down. Wood splintered and cracked loudly. He began stomping his expensive leather shoes directly into the delicate flower beds, crushing the rare blooms into the wet, soaked mud. He was tearing apart months of my hard work. In a matter of seconds, my daughter dropped her crayons and gasped in fear. I rushed over, putting myself between him and my little girl. "What is wrong with you?" I demanded, keeping my voice firm but refusing to shout. He stopped, breathing hard, looking at the destruction he had just caused. And then, I saw the exact moment his panic morphed into a calculated, evil plan. He heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. The estate owner had returned from Europe, a day early. Before I could even process what was happening, the cousin ripped his own tie, smeared a bit of dirt on his white shirt, and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He pointed at me, playing the role of the terrified victim. "You're crazy. Stop destroying her property," he yelled, making sure his voice carried all the way to the front gates. And that brings us back to this exact moment. The young millionaire came running around the corner, her elegant travel coat trailing behind her. She froze in her tracks. She looked at the shattered trellis. She looked at the crushed, beautiful roses lying in the mud. She looked at her cousin, who was currently putting on the performance of a lifetime. He went crazy. The cousin yelled, rushing over to her side. I caught him trying to steal the bonsai trees. And when I told him to stop, he completely lost his mind. He started smashing the roses. "You need to fire this psycho, and call the police right now." I stood there, feeling the terrified heartbeat of my daughter against my chest. When faced with malicious destruction from petty people who envy your goodness, how do you maintain your inner peace to protect your family? Leave a comment and share your spirit of steel. I swore to my very soul. Evil people might trample the wildflowers under their feet, but they can never extinguish the seeds of love and pride I plant in my child's life. Hit subscribe to help us water the gardens of kindness. The millionaire looked at him, then looked at me. The air in the courtyard was thick with tension. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. She stepped closer to me, her eyes scanning the destruction. My daughter buried her face deeper into my apron, terrified of the yelling. I looked the millionaire directly in the eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scramble to explain myself. "Ma'am," I said quietly, keeping my hands gently over my daughter's ears. "I have spent the last 18 months treating this soil like it was my own. I would never hurt a single leaf in this garden. That is all I have to say." The cousin scoffed loudly, throwing his hands in the air. "Oh, please. Look at him," he sneered. "He's a jealous, violent thug. He's lying to your face." But the young woman wasn't listening to him anymore. She was a self-made millionaire for a reason. She didn't get to the top by listening to the loudest person in the room. She got there by paying attention to the details everyone else missed. She slowly lowered her gaze to the ground. She looked at my heavy rubber work boots. They were caked in mud, completely flat on the bottom, with thick, wide treads meant for grip. Then, she walked right past me and stepped right to the edge of the ruined antique rose bed. She crouched down, her expensive wool coat brushing against the wet dirt. She stared intently at the soft, yielding mud right next to the broken trellis. Pressed deeply into the dark earth was a perfectly preserved footprint. It wasn't a wide, flat work boot. It was the distinct, narrow shape of an Italian leather dress shoe, complete with a sharp pointed toe. Right in the center of the heel print, stamped perfectly into the mud, was the embossed logo of a high-end luxury brand. She stood up slowly. She turned her head and looked directly at her cousin's feet. He shifted his weight nervously. The bottom edge of his shiny, pointed-toe leather shoes was completely coated in fresh, wet mud. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The cousin's confident smirk melted right off his face. "Well," he stammered, his face turning pale. He must have pushed me into the dirt while he was attacking the plants." The millionaire didn't yell. She didn't curse. Her voice was ice cold, carrying a quiet authority that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "The footprint is facing the trellis," she said softly. "You weren't pushed backward. You stepped forward. With force. To pull it down." She pulled her phone out of her pocket. "Pack your bags," she told him, not breaking eye contact. "You have exactly 10 minutes to get off my property." "But, wait. You can't be serious," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm family." "You are a parasite," she replied, her tone completely deadpan. "And if you are not past those front gates in 10 minutes, I am calling the police and pressing charges for vandalism and attempted theft." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and total humiliation. But there was nothing he could do. He turned around and practically ran back toward the guest house, his expensive shoes slipping awkwardly on the wet pavement. When a wealthy estate owner decisively cuts off a toxic relative, what lesson does that teach you about protecting your healthy boundaries? Share your civilized thoughts below. Lord, please bless and warm every honest flower that has to endure the brutal storms of life, and warm the hearts of the quiet workers who offer their sweetness to the world. Hit subscribe to walk alongside us. After the cousin disappeared, I expected the millionaire to go inside and call a cleanup crew. Instead, she did something that completely shocked me. She didn't care about her expensive clothes. She dropped to her knees, right there in the mud. She gently reached out and picked up a broken stem of the century-old antique rose. I immediately knelt down beside her, bringing my daughter with me. "I am so sorry," the millionaire whispered, looking at the crushed petals in her hands. She wasn't just apologizing for the flowers. She was apologizing for what I had to endure. "You didn't do this, ma'am," I said softly, my hands working quickly to stabilize the surviving roots. She looked up at me. Her eyes weren't looking at a hired hand anymore. They were looking at a man she deeply respected. A man who had stood like a giant oak tree to protect his child, refusing to be dragged into the mud by a coward. "Starting today," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion, "you are no longer just the gardener. I am putting you in charge of the entire estate's grounds and maintenance. No one will ever speak to you like that on this property again. You have my word." I just nodded, a lump forming in my throat that I couldn't quite swallow. The storm had finally passed. My little girl let go of my apron and reached out her tiny hand. She gently patted the soil around the base of the rescued rose bush, smiling for the first time all morning. Even though the mud was messy and the garden was bruised, the sweet, pure scent of the antique roses still filled the air. Leave a peaceful blessing in the comments to help my daughter and I bring warmth back to this beautiful balcony of flowers.